Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Audrey Lichter, the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Today's Scholar Circle topic is Friends or Foe, the Complex Relationships Among Jihadi Groups, featuring Dr. Barak Mendelson. Chai Mitzvah is a national organization now celebrating its 16th year. We are the sponsor of Scholar Circle and a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversations for teens and adults, lay or professionally led. For more information, please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is our founder and board president, who authored a best-selling book, Conspiracy U, a Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right of the political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book along with the accompanying curriculum, which has been taught to hundreds of college students and others on the Chai Mitzvah website and also wherever books are sold. The curriculum was also taught in a recorded series by Dr. Andrew Pessin. You will receive all this information in our follow-up email as well. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. We are excited to continue the Scholar Circle program, and we need your support to keep it thriving. Scholar Circle has engaged nearly 3,000 participants since 10/7, and your donation will enable us to continue bringing international scholars to you at no charge to share their expertise on the evolving Jewish world in the aftermath of October 7th. Please help us reach our goal of $40,000. To make a donation, please visit chaimitzvah.org and click on the gold menu tab, Scholar Circle, and select Support Scholar Circle. This will be included in our follow-up email as well. Thank you for continuing to support this engaging program for all. Our featured scholar tonight is Dr. Barak Mendelson. He is a professor of political science at Haverford College. He holds a doctoral degree in government from Cornell University, an MA in Security Studies from Tel Aviv University, and a BA in Middle East Studies from the Hebrew University, Jerusalem. Dr. Mendelson specializes in international security, primarily radical jihadi organizations. He is the author of 3 books, Combating Jihadism, American Hegemony, and Interstate Cooperation in the War on Terrorism, the al-Qaeda franchise, the expansion of al-Qaeda and its consequences, and Jihadism Constrained, the limits of transnational jihadism and what it means for counterterrorism. Dr. Mendelson is also the author of numerous articles in academic journals and various media outlets. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Barak Mendelson.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. Hi, everybody. Let me just put my presentation up. Okay. So first, forgive me, it is a little bit strange to speak to an audience that you cannot really see. So I will do my best. So let's start. On December 8th, a big event happened. The regime of Bashar al-Assad, who was the leader of Syria for 25 years, collapsed and fell. Leading the offensive against it was a group called HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham. Leading that group was a guy called Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who, after the revolution, after the deposing of Bashar al-Assad, revealed himself as Ahmad al-Shara, So we have here a case of a guy that started actually as a jihadi and now is leading Syria. And of course, the observers had very different views about what's going on. So here is the title of an article on the BBC that speaks about the transition, the transformation that al-Julani made from a jihadist leader to a rebel politician. On the other hand, you have others that say, well, you can't go from al-Qaeda to human rights overnight, right? And so you see a lot of skepticism. Even in the UN Security Council's monitoring team report, just from last month, we see that some member states characterize al-Julani's leadership approach as ideologically opportunistic. What does ideologically opportunistic mean? I can think about two potential ways. One would be that ideology is not very important for him. Therefore, he can shift between ideologies um, without any significant problem. The alternative is to say, well, the opportunism is in the actions, but the beliefs are still the same. And what we are seeing is just an effort to mask HTS real jihadi intentions. At the same time that we see these kind of conflicts about how to treat this jihadi or maybe former jihadi, the main jihadi groups are still operating. Again, to the Security Council monitoring team report. ISIL, Al Qaeda, and affiliates remained resilient and adaptable to external counterterrorism pressure. Aided by less centralized organizational structure, the threat they posed remained undiminished. And I want to focus on that point because this seems to be now the sense of consensus that Al Qaeda and the Islamic State are still posing an undiminished threat. As you will see, my argument will try to challenge that kind of assertion. So the research questions that I'm going to discuss in this talk are two. How severe is the jihadi terrorist threat? And second, which is already a hint to the answer for the first question, is how does the complexity of jihadi groups reduce the threat that jihadism poses, at least in the West? Let me start with the key takeaways, right? I never know when people will run away. So here are the main things that I will try to convey in this talk. First is that the jihadi movement is actually weaker than the sum of its part. Rather than considering the jihadi threat as the aggregation of all jihadi groups together collaborating against their enemies, primarily the West or regimes that are insufficiently Muslim. In reality, I argue that the jihadi movement is weaker than the sum of its parts. A second takeaway is that jihadi groups and jihadis regularly argue and sometimes even fight, and their fights can be vicious and can be very violent as well. So there were some times in which, rather than actually fighting non-jihadi elements, some jihadi groups were busy fighting each other, obviously reducing their threat. The third point is that conflict among jihadis can result from very diverse factors. We have seen ideological conflicts within the same social movement. We saw differences in views about what's the best strategy to go about achieving those groups' goals. And we see a lot of personality clashes. The whole pettiness that you see in regular day between normal human beings are very prevalent even among jihadi groups. And in some ways, the conditions of rebellion or underground is only making for these kind of personality clashes to become much more salient. A fourth point that I will make is that we see even within each of these groups internal tensions. Since the leadership of both groups has universal aspirations, but the branches that they rely on often have very different kind of interest and often focus more on localized issues, leading to ideological incoherence within the organizations. And finally, jihadi groups are much more likely to gain acceptance when they do shed their jihadi ideology and moderate their actions. Hayat Tahrir Sham is the best example so far for that. But you saw that even the Taliban, part of the agreement that it signed with the United States in the late teens, required that um, it will no longer threaten the security of other actors and basically shedding parts of their religious jihadi ideology. However, in contrast to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, the Taliban were not very serious about that, and you see the difference in the acceptance of the Taliban versus the much more significant relationship that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has managed to create with the international community. Let's start with just a brief overview of the main actors that we have, primarily Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So Al-Qaeda was established in 1988. It is currently on its third leader, Saif al-Adel, who is currently present in Iran, as opposed to his predecessors, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, who resided in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where they had much more freedom of operation. Al Qaeda is best known for the 9/11 attacks. I used to think that this is not something that requires saying, but I'm teaching students that were born in 2005, and apparently 9/11 for many people is just history, and for many, history that they never really heard about. As for the organizational structure of Al Qaeda, it has a two-tier structure with central leadership above, what we call Al Qaeda Central, and below it, some subordinated branches. Among those branches, we have a branch in Yemen called the Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There is a branch in Central Asia, Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. There is a branch in Somalia, very familiar, Al Shabaab. There is a branch in North Africa called Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And that branch has a sub branch called JNIM, who operates primarily in the Sahel and is extremely successful. And finally, they have a branch in Syria called Hoas Adin. The other main group is the Islamic State. In the picture here, you see its first caliph, Bakr al-Baghdadi, giving his first speech as a caliph in June 2014. Now, the Islamic State was formed in 2006. It was formed based on a merger of many local groups together with Al Qaeda's branch in Iraq that was back then led by Abu Musab al Zarqawi. In 2006, they first merged to create the Islamic State of Iraq. But later on, we know them in 2013 under the name ISIS or ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, or Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And for others that are familiar as Daesh, I will refer to the group most of the time as simply the Islamic State. That's the name that it's giving itself. Among its original leaders, as I said, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who led the Al-Qaeda branch in Iraq. Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, who was the first leader of the Islamic State of Iraq, and Abu Ayyub al-Masri, who was his Minister of Defense, originally from al-Qaeda in Iraq. And once they died, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi took their position. He's the one that led the Islamic State to its greatest successes. The Islamic State is best known for establishing a caliphate in 2014. The organizational structure of the Islamic State organization these days is very different. During the time that it actually held its territorial caliphate, it actually controlled significant territories, especially in Iraq and in Syria, but also some territory in Libya and elsewhere. But since the collapse of the caliphate following the operations of the coalition led by the United States, the Islamic State reverted back to an organization. And as an organization, it has a central leadership. Below that central leadership, there are regional offices. There is an office in West Africa. There is an office, the most important office actually, in East Asia, in East Africa, located in Somalia. And it has some additional regional offices, places like Central Asia, especially Afghanistan. Below those regional offices, we see branches. So, for example, the regional office for East Asia is responsible for two of the Islamic State branches in the area. Now, what do all these jihadi groups share before we get to speaking about how they differ? First is that when we speak about the jihadi movement, we really are speaking about Sunni groups. Sunni groups that have their origins in Salafism. Muslims around the world are divided largely to Sunnis and Shia, with Sunnis representing something like 85% of the Muslim population worldwide. Muslim population worldwide is something between 1.6 billion to 1.8 billion. These numbers are really important because as we speak about the jihadi groups, it is important that we don't conflate jihadi groups with Islam, since these jihadi groups really represent only a minuscule minority of Muslims worldwide, and the overwhelming majority of Muslims totally reject the ideology of al-Qaeda. But al-Qaeda and the other jihadi groups. But as I said, all these jihadi groups are Sunni. Their origins is in Salafism. This is the least progressive, the most conservative view of Islam, one that is practiced primarily in the Arabian Peninsula, especially in Saudi Arabia. And so it gives you a sense of where they really stand in terms of moderation or the absence of moderation compared to other Muslim streams. It's important to be clear about the things that I live outside of this movement. So a group like Hezbollah is considered outside of that movement because Hezbollah is a Shia organization, and therefore its ideology is very different than the ideology that brings together these jihadi groups, even if there are some aspects of sympathy between some Sunni groups and Hezbollah. And we even see some cases of cooperation between Sunni jihadi groups and Shia groups, like we've seen with al-Qaeda branches cooperating with the Houthis in Yemen recently. What else do they share? What makes them a jihadi movement is jihad. This group view jihad as violence. You have different views about what is really jihad. For many Muslims, jihad will be interpreted as the internal struggle with one's own demons and the struggle to become a better person. But for the jihadis, they understand jihad as a violent religious war carried out in the name of Allah and designed to enhance His word and to expand the territory that Islam is ruling. For jihadi groups, jihad is not just important. For many of them, it's actually a sixth pillar of Islam. Jihadis are also distinct from other actors, while sharing all jihadi groups share the view that politics is practically irrelevant. The way that one needs to achieve their political objectives is through violent jihad. They also all reject the secular state. The secular state is run by man made law, and man made law means that people are subverting the authority of God to legislate. God is the only sovereign to make legislation. Therefore, any state that is based on legislation by the people, especially as we see in democracies, are therefore rejected totally by the jihadis, um, and are accused of making themselves into gods. The most important thing that jihadis all want to do is to implement Sharia law. They also look to restore the caliphate. And yet, despite all these similarities, the Islamic State wanted to eliminate Al Qaeda. Branches of the two groups have been occasionally fighting each other, fighting and killing each other, whether in Syria, in the Sahel, Yemen, and in Somalia. In Syria, Hayat Tahrir Sham, that I mentioned early on, has been fighting both the Islamic State and Al Qaeda. But let's focus on the differences between these jihadi groups. So, one element of distinctions between different jihadi groups concern the question of who do they see as their main enemy. For some jihadis, the focus needs to be on toppling local regimes, Muslim regimes that are insufficiently Muslim and that repress the public. Right? So you've had groups like that operating in Egypt for a long time. Uh, there were groups such as those operating in Libya, in Algeria, and elsewhere in the Muslim world. Then there are jihadi groups that, or jihadi actors that believe that fighting needs to focus on non-Muslims that invade Muslim countries. And the goal of that jihad is to liberate our Muslim brethren from non-Muslim invaders. And this was the logic behind the war, the jihadi war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And that was the logic behind the fight against the United States in Iraq. Then there is a third approach, and this is approach that was unique to Osama bin Laden. That was the real innovation that Al Qaeda brought, and that was seeing the United States as the main enemy. While the local regimes were considered the near enemy, the United States was considered the far enemy. And the reason to attack the United States was because of the understanding, at least in their view, that the United States standing behind local regimes and that there is no point in fighting the local regimes because that only weakens the power of the jihadis when we should really attack the head of the snake, the United States, and lead ultimately to its demise, which would then will allow to liberate Muslims from the tyranny of their local regimes. So this is one major distinction that we see among jihadi groups. Another distinction that is very important is between groups that are state focused versus groups that are system focused. And this relates really to the idea of where religion relies or is positioned compared to the state based order. We live in a system of states. And indeed, most rebel groups that, or terrorist groups that are trying to operate, seek to bring down local regimes, whether it's in Muslim countries or elsewhere. But the nature of terrorism is most often we see that it is focused on bringing down certain kind of regimes and an aspiration to then become to substitute these regimes or to establish an independent state that will be a part of this state-based order, that will join the United Nations, that will become part of this international society. And so these are actors, these are the traditional jihadi groups that really, while had a notion of we want God words to rule supreme throughout the world, understood the limitations and focused their efforts on changing the regime in their own countries. But then you have groups like al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and these groups have a very different perspective. Their focus is not just about bringing change in one location or the other. They want to overthrow the whole system and establish in its stead a global caliphate. A global caliphate that will rule throughout the world and that in the process will eliminate all states. So what they envision is something that's going to be very, very different than uh, um, what we are seeing in the world around us. They envision a very different world. Another major difference is what kind of jihad they are pursuing. People that study the jihadi movement emphasize two types of jihad: defensive jihad and offensive jihad. Defensive jihad is a jihad in which Muslims come to the aid of their brothers to defend against foreign invaders. In the case that non-Muslims attack a Muslim country, it becomes obligatory on all Muslims, including young kids that can go, young adults that can go without the permission of their parents, a wife without the permission of her husband, a slave without the permission of his master. This is a collective duty that every Muslim must take to come and help. Offensive jihad, on the other hand, is something that is extremely narrow and extremely rare. The idea in offensive jihad is that under a caliphate, right, you need to have a caliph in order to promote offensive jihad. Offensive jihad is the jihad to expand the territory that Islam is ruling. And for to satisfy the demands of offensive jihad, you need to have, as I said, a caliph and to send at least one raid on an enemy land once a year. Most jihadis prefer to emphasize the frame of defensive jihad, trying to appeal to more Muslims to join the fight through the emotions relating to the oppression of Muslims. Offensive jihad is something that we identify primarily with the Islamic State. Another distinction is view of other Islamist groups, whether they are jihadis or not. When I say not jihadis, one of the groups that I'm talking about is Hamas, which is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. But as opposed to most branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas is violent, as we've seen too well on October 7, and of course, many years before and since. And so these are groups that jihadi groups need to consider whether they are willing to cooperate with them, especially secular groups, and whether they are willing to share power. And different jihadi groups will have different positions about who is a legitimate partner for an offensive and who can never be allied with. Well, again, the focus of the Islamic State is to narrow as much as possible who are legitimate actors, while other jihadi groups are much more willing to cooperate with others. And we saw that when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham went on its offensive that ultimately brought down Assad, they collaborated with a whole range of forces. Some of those forces are secular. Some other distinctions. So they all want the caliphate, but when is the time to establish the caliphate? For the Islamic State, the answer was now. This needs to be now. And indeed, they tried to form a caliphate, or at least announce a caliphate, in the end of June 2014. In contrast, a group like al-Qaeda, while seeks to bring the caliphate, understands that this is a long process. And in fact, Osama bin Laden himself was resistant even to the establishment of smaller political entities, emirates, that will be independent because he feared that as long as the jihadis are so weak, any premature effort to establish an Islamic State would result in its demise because it would bring about attacks from the United States. And so the Al Qaeda perspective is that we need to postpone the efforts to establish the caliphate. There are a lot more stages that need to happen before. Three last big differences: permissibility of takfir, which means excommunication. To those of you that don't know, the punishment for excommunication in Islam is death. Right? So this is something that is very problematic, and most Muslims will stay away from any kind of proclamation of takfir, in part by the logic of who are we to actually know what is in one person's heart. This is for God to actually know and act upon it. But actors like the Islamic State has been really engaged in actions of takfir, and they were excommunicating not just ordinary Muslims or Muslims that were much more lax in their view of Islam and in practicing Islam. The Islamic State even excommunicated other jihadi groups. We also have other cases in Algeria in the 1990s. A group called the GIA declared all Algerian society as excommunicated and basically as a society that can be killed, legitimately killed. They differ in the limits of permissible violence. For Al Qaeda and more so even for other jihadi groups, there are some standards, some criteria that need to uh, limit the violence, that need to make the violence more strategic and to avoid the pitfalls of killing innocents. That also comes together with a broader view of who is considered an innocent and therefore somebody that must not be killed. In the case of the Islamic State, there are basically no bounds. Any kind of violence against the enemy is legitimate, and you can always find some kind of religious legitimation uh, to go with that kind of violence. And finally, different jihadi groups differ in their views of the Shia. Now, all jihadi groups have hostile positions towards the Shia, but some of them say, al-Qaeda is one example, we should wait with the fight against the Shia till we actually finish the fighting the most important enemy, which is the United States. But then you had people like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and later on, the members of the Islamic State in Iraq. And of course, we saw later on when they turned into the Islamic State. Their view of the Shia is that the Shia are even worse than the Jews. And the Shia, as a result, are the enemy. They can be killed. There are no distinction between ordinary Shia and people that actually hold positions in a Shia regime or a Shia military or a Shia-based police. There are also some other weakening factors that we should note. So even within organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, we see a lot of internal conflict. So it's not just conflict between jihadi organizations, but even within jihadi organizations. So traditionally, everywhere that foreign fighters came to join locals in fighting jihad, they ended up outraging the locals, fighting the locals. The locals were very bitter about the better conditions that foreign fighters got, the foreign fighters' inability to understand the local culture, and the foreign fighters' arrogance and attempt to impose their traditions on the locals. We also see conflict between the leadership of these organizations and the leadership of their branches. Because while the leadership of groups like Al Qaeda and the Islamic State has this globalist orientation and they want to bring change throughout the world, the branches tend to focus on local causes. The branches tend to want to take power within the territory that they're fighting, within their national boundaries, maybe expand a little bit, but their focus is on actually fighting inside the Muslim world, not in fighting the biggest powers, non-Muslim powers like the United States. We see differences also in different levels of radicalization, of radicalism within these groups. Right? You will be amazed to know that in the Islamic State, you have not just radicals, you also have ultra radicals. That at some points, the radicals of the Islamic State had to get rid of the ultra radicals because their logic was such that it basically made almost anybody that disagreed with their position excommunicated and a target for killing. Jihadi groups, especially the big ones, are also now facing serious communication problems. We spoke about the differences in orientation of the globalists that want to overturn the world order and the local branches that tend to focus on bringing about change in their own countries. This, of course, leads to problems in the delegation because the branches often don't do what the leaders, the globalist leaders, actually want to do. But the leaders have serious problems. They cannot communicate their what they would like to do quick enough or in a way that is persuasive enough. And when the branches ignore them, those leadership don't really have strong enforcement mechanisms. To the point that Al Qaeda Central, rather than try to discipline some of its branches, had instead to release a code of conduct in which it tries, in through educational means, to explain to its members in the branches what Al Qaeda sees as legitimate targets and what not. And finally, weakening factor is what I call the aggregation problem. This is especially important for al-Qaeda and the Islamic State because of their huge expectations. So their vision requires change not just in one place, but everywhere. So what do you do when you are creating change in some places? How do you create the synergy that will allow you to move from fighting in a few locations to actually combining those fights and establishing the big caliphate that they really need? And as I show in my book, Jihadism Constraint, in terms of strategic planning, none of the jihadi groups actually have any plan that allows them to aggregate, not just to have success in different locations, but to build on that success to create a much more cohesive new entity. So let me end with just these claims. Uh, the consequences of what I said is that threats of attacks in the United States continue. Right? You can still kill people in the United States, especially in the United States with the availability of weapons, but the threat is really low. The threat, significant threat to the country, to its strategic interest, is low. At the same time, jihadis could topple some weak regimes. We saw that in Syria, and we are likely to see that happening soon in the Sahel. And unfortunately, it might also happen in a place like Somalia. I also argue, as I said, that we are exaggerating the threat posed by al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. That means that not that we should not pay attention to those groups, but we need to think harder, understand the distinctions between them and those factors that lead to their weakening. Once we understand that, we should expand cleavages between those jihadist groups and even within them. Last 2 points, we need to be very cautious not to overreact. Overreaction could be highly self-defeating. Not every jihadi attack is worthy of the kind of response that the United States could produce following. And to end with where I started, the example of Hayat Tahrir Sham seems to suggest that even jihadi groups may rethink their ideologies and strategies, and hopefully some of the jihadi groups will understand that the only way that they can actually achieve some of their political objectives would be by moderating their ideology and their actions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Mendelsohn. That was quite a tour. Okay, there are a number of questions. There are questions related to Syria specifically to really understand who these people are, if truly this is an opportunistic transition, when they say that they're maybe modernizing themselves, or is it a ploy, or is it truly a change of attitude that you describe at the end of your talk? So Claire Green asks, how do most so yeah, what can you tell us about Syria, and which UN member states alleged his reinvention was opportunistic?
Um, so well, the main country that sees this as opportunistic and is extremely worried is Israel. That by now has had very bad experience with radical Islamist actors and is looking with lots of hesitancy and worry about what's going on in Syria. But my perspective is that I think that Israel is wrong in this. I think that Hayat Tahrir Sham has undergone so many phases it really paid a significant price already in showing that it's serious about its intentions. It got rid of its affiliation with the Islamic State first to focus on its affiliation with al-Qaeda, only to later on leave al-Qaeda. Also importantly, very early on, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, even under the name Jabhat al-Nusra beforehand, was very clear that it has no intention of attacking outside of Syria. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham also got into serious fights with the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and jihadi scholars. And you cannot really go to those kind of fights if it's just a ploy.
Hmm.
Right? Because they suffered significant, there is a real rupture within the jihadi movement because of the actions of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So they actually show themselves. And in the last couple of years, they made significant outreach to communities within Idlib, that was the province that they ruled. And later on, when they started the campaign that ultimately brought down Assad after, I think it was 9 or 11 days, it was conducted together with additional fronts that are not jihadi or don't have any jihadi background. Now, having said that, I would not want to live under the regime that is dominated by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But to say that under Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Syrians have fewer freedoms than they had under Bashar al-Assad would be completely false. To say that under the rule of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Syrians have less freedoms than Muslims in practically any other Arab country would also be false. So I think that we should be cautious, but all the evidence suggests that this is a real transformation. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham made acts that it's going to be impossible to reverse.
Hmm. Um, could you step back for just 1 minute and explain one, you talked about billions of Muslims, but how many jihadists are there? What percentage of the Muslim population would you say are jihadists? And what is the relationship between the Muslims and the jihadist groups? Are they responsible or are they interested in reining them in? Are they like, what is that relationship like? And is there any hope that we can that they will curtail some of the violent actions of these groups themselves?
I think the picture is a lot more positive than we tend to think. We tend to focus on the bad things because they create news. But remember the number of Muslims worldwide that I mentioned, so it's between 1.6 billion and 1.8 billion. Now, the most generous assessment of how many foreign fighters joined the Islamic State in Syria. And remember, the Islamic State in Syria, formed a caliphate and sold to sympathizers an ideal and a chance to participate in the utopian building of the caliphate. And Al Qaeda promised them the fight to get to the caliphate. The Islamic State actually offered them something right now. And yet, only 50,000 Muslims made the way to the caliphate. Now, you can probably count the number of sympathizers. It's probably going to be much bigger. And let's say that even if you have only 2 million sympathizers, still 2 million can be a serious threat. But most of the people on this world are not engaged in terrorism. Most of the 2 million sympathizers, let's say that that would be the numbers, would never really imagine actually taking any kind of action. Uh, and it's much harder to now get to different kind of conflict arenas because different states are much more aware of that kind of threat. We also need to pay attention to public opinion surveys that show that Muslims overwhelmingly reject the visions of the jihadis. Even those that would like to see more religion in their life, they would like that religion to be focused on issues of family, not in terms of general state policies. And of course, their views of what kind of religious Shari'i law they would like to see. This is nothing like the radical version of the Sharia law that the Islamic State and al-Qaeda would like to impose. Most Muslims worldwide would like to see democracy, and most Muslims worldwide just completely reject that kind of violence that we are seeing. When we see in the United States that in many places, Muslim communities actually made significant contribution helping to root out bad apples within their communities. And I gotta say that for me, I'm a little troubled that people were asking Muslim communities because I think that as American citizens, we need each one of us when they see something that is a threat to society, we need to report that as individuals. I don't expect Muslims to have any higher burden just because they are Muslims. But I do expect any person that is living here that knows about a threat to reveal that to the authorities. But as I said, we actually saw a lot of that. So I think that we have a significant room for optimism.
So on that vein, there are a number of questions about the future. What do I'm sure you can't predict uh, totally, but what in your estimation is the future for jihadism? As you know, will they more modernize? Will they be tempered? What would you say is the future here? And what is the role of Iran in all of this?
Let me start with Iran because that's easier. Iran has instrumental relationship with uh, Al-Qaeda and with Al-Qaeda branches, but these are not friendly relationships. Right? They can cooperate. Saif al-Adel, as I said, has a refuge in Iran, but at the same time, it's clear to them that they have also conflicting interests. So Iran will support them only to some extent because remember that ultimately, for those groups, Iran as a Shia state is a serious problem by itself. Right? So that doesn't mean that we don't see cooperation. Just look at the cooperation that we see between Al Shabaab and the Houthis, right? Between Somali branch of Al Qaeda and one of the allies of Shia allies of Iran. As for the future of the jihadi movement, you will continuously see some of those radical elements. Those ideas are not going to die. The question are just how appealing they're going to have and how much damage they can produce. They can produce more damage in areas where we see much less stability. Uh, but we do have some good reasons to think that there are some actors, jihadi actors, that look at the case of Khat Rasham and say, well, maybe this is a better model for us. Right? They see the Taliban still ruling. They see Khat Rasham actually negotiating with the United States on removing the sanctions on Syria. And so there are some indicators already that the subgroup of Al Qaeda, JNIM, operating in the Sahel and controlling significant parts of Mali and Burkina Faso, right? When they bring down those regimes, and there is a good chance that they will bring down those regimes, there are already some indicators that they are thinking about dissociating themselves from al-Qaeda Central, because ultimately their focus is on the area that they were born in, around their people, and on running a state in those areas. And if you remain a jihadi, well, you might be able to take over a state in the Sahel, but it's going to be very hard for you to actually sustain that kind of state, as the jihadis saw in 2013 when they took over parts of Mali to establish an independent state. So I think that there are some positive trends, but the jihadi movement is not going away. Those radical ideas are not going away. And their appeal to some people in the West isn't going away. And so while the general threat, strategic threat, I think is declining, the threat of attacks is not necessarily diminished. The threat of attack is still highly relevant. What I hope is that states will be very cautious and not overreact to these kind of attacks, because it's those kind of overreaction such that bring to the conquest of Muslim countries that then produces new causes for the jihadis and start a new cycle.
So you began by saying that jihadis is weaker than the sum of its parts.
Yes.
Could you explain exactly what you meant by that?
What I meant that if you just look at the numbers of all jihadi groups and adopt the prevailing American view that all jihadis are the same, then by the number, the jihadis were supposed to be a much more serious threat than they are. What I was trying to do in our conversation is to show that not only they are fragmented significantly, but that fragmentation actually leads them, in some cases, to even fight each other. So not only do they have these huge aspirations that require that they collaborate, they cannot collaborate. And in fact, sometimes they will even kill each other and basically leave what's supposed to be their real enemies alone.
We just have a few 2 minutes left. So before we conclude, what would you like to leave us with?
Um, I would like us to understand that there is a complexity, not to rush to buy anything that you read about. Al Qaeda is that, Islamic State is that, jihad is that, jihadis are that, but to understand that there are complex elements here, to understand that jihadis can be as incompetent as non jihadis. They can be egomaniacal as non jihadis, and many of them in the leadership are, and that they can actually fight each other. So the main message is that yes, there is a threat. Yes, we need to understand it better, to understand its complexity. And no, we should not make it more significant than it is, because by doing that, we might create self-fulfilling prophecies.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mendelsohn, for giving us a tour of the jihadi landscape. And thank you for being with us tonight. And all of you will get this in your mailbox, and you can also find this lecture that you can share on our website. And there are many more questions that we didn't get to, and you'll get a link to be able to access Dr. Mendelsohn, be able to speak with him, and he's willing to answer your questions through email as well.
Yes, I'll be happy to. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank the audience for listening.
Very good. So our next Scholars Circle lecture will feature Dr. Shel Horowitz, and the topic will be Anti-Semitism, Old and New, Understanding Persistence and Change in Today's World. So please join us on Tuesday, April 8th at 7 p.m. That's Tuesday, April 8th at 7 p.m. with Dr. Shel Horowitz.
He's awesome. He's a wonderful guy and an awesome speaker.
Great. Yes, we love him too. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you on April 8th. Good night.
Thank you.